Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Getting Personal with Compt. I'm Lauren Schneider, the head of communications, and this is a show that is all about discussing the ways in which we can make the workplace a little bit more human. I love talking about the human experience, not just the employee experience, because I think too often we forget that employees are people too. So, with that, today I have a wonderful guest, Ari Simon, founder of Grief at Work. Ari, tell me a little bit about yourself, your experience, introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Ari Simon, they, them pronouns. I am the founder of Grief at Work, which is a skill building, staff training kind of platform and program for really learning how to be a grief and loss competent workplace, team, and community. And this really is kind of a beautiful way I've gotten to weave my background in public policy and public and nonprofit management, also doing a lot of organizational development work over the years, particularly in kind of client facing ways and community facing roles with kind of a career pivot I took several years ago. Grief and loss has been something that's touched my life in many acute ways at times, but I never thought it could be a career. I started just doing kind of hospice and end of life care volunteering, and then was doing some kind of extracurricular, like outside of my work life programs and practices around holding space for sort of conversations around death and grief. We'll get a little bit more into that probably on this episode. But yeah, then really, then the pandemic happened, and it kind of was the big kick for me of like, actually, people really need this kind of support. And so many people are just not connecting the dots of like how this shows up in our working and professional lives too. And I have certainly my own experience of working in city government for a handful of years, and just how much loss was not recognized, loss was not processed, loss was not something we could talk about. And it created a really difficult, dare I say, toxic work environment, where people didn't feel that psychologically safe, that being stressed was kind of the name of the game.
Mm.
And where I think it really impacted our ability to serve our clients and communities very well. So this is how I've come forward about, I guess I developed Grief at Work in 2020 and kind of launched it in 2021. Started having some really amazing client successes with different organizations and teams in 2022. And now we're here. And it's been really amazing to just see how like interest in this is really growing. I think this is really starting to make sense for people, especially as they feel through their own experiences of loss, on personal levels, on just kind of collectively what we're experiencing in this world during this time levels. So it's just great to be here. Glad to be on the show.
I'm so glad that you're here because I think this is a topic where, first of all, if you're able to specialize in this, I think that says a lot. This is something that is very seriously occurring, not just in the workplace, but everywhere. You mentioned, and we talk about this, I feel like a lot on the show, that COVID really changed things. The world of work is not what we knew. And I feel like the future of work or the now of work, because we see so many different headlines and conversations happening, is so dependent on these types of conversations and the way that we handle things. So I wanted to ask you with that, tell me a little bit more about why it's so important for employers and even like your colleagues, your coworkers to understand this topic and to make space for grief in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think people's experience with how it feels to go through a tough time while they're working just really sets the bar for how they're going to feel about their work experience overall. I think this is just a huge aspect of resilience, in the workplace and kind of in our whole lives. And so, to me, this is really the difference of like, do you have a psychologically safe workplace, where people feel like they can show up as their whole self, right? And I think, what's important is we'll probably talk about this in other ways too, but that just like a one size fits all approach really doesn't work. And so of course this isn't to say that someone has to come to work and like bear their entire emotional soul at work. That's not what this means at all. But it just means that they don't feel like they have to completely silo themselves, force themselves to operate in a way that's actually, not healthy and not safe for them to do so when they're encountering major loss. And this just really opens up kind of the portal of trust. And I think,
Mm.
like, to me, trust building and creating a sense of choice for people is like the name of the game.
Yeah.
And so that way we know that, like, and again, I'm just relating it back to my own experience of like, if I go through a major loss, if someone in my life passes, if my community experiences some kind of climate catastrophe, if I'm taking on extra responsibilities because loved ones have COVID, whatever it is, or like my community is being faced with war and violence, like, uh, can I show up to work and feel safe and feel seen and feel supported? And
Hmm.
knowing that I'm going to have some flexibility when I need it, some sense of resources and support when I need it, and some encouragement to, yeah, again, just be able to like be who I am and still bring my best to this workplace and not have the fact that I'm a human being experiencing loss be something that's detrimental or a negative on like who I am in this workplace or in this workforce. And I think sadly, so often that's kind of the case is like if you're for people who are just carrying a lot of loss, that it's almost like that's somehow a detriment to them feeling like they can be a successful participant in a workplace. And obviously I think besides just the pandemic component, I also just think sort of the racial justice reckonings of the last several years has also been just such a component of this too, because it's really reminding us that like, right, like uh, something I like to bring out in my grief at work program a lot is that holding this both, right, that um, we have to remember that any of us can experience loss at any time. Loss is super random, right? Because this life is unpredictable. And certain people are going to experience more loss than others because they are born into a lineage that has experienced oppression, because they are in a body that experiences disability, because for any variety of reasons. And therefore certain people are just going to potentially need more space, flexibility, and resources when it comes to grief and loss than others. And like we have to find a way to be okay with that, and actually kind of nurture it and support it with programs and policies in the workplace.
That's so interesting that you say that because we've recently been talking more and more about, of course, as an HR tech company, benefits in the workplace, but how social determinants of health impact these things and what people are truly looking for in what they're asking for in terms of support. And I think we talk about, socioeconomic status and things that are happening in your life, but we tend to, I think, miss the grief part of that. And maybe that's because people so often associate grief specifically with loss. So you think of bereavement leave, or, someone in your family passed away, and how that impacts how you can show up at work and your productivity and where your head is at. But not all of these other factors. I think we're starting to understand what health and wellness means for people, and that it's not just your physical body but your mental state as well, your financial wellness and what that looks like. But I'm interested to learn from you, how do you feel like this conversation has, or how have you seen this conversation um, change over time?
Yeah. Well, to your point, I think part of what's allowed this conversation to change is a recognition that grieving, like that process, is really just our natural, necessary response for processing and repairing from any kind of loss, any kind of major loss that touches our lives. And This is like a little bit of, kind of psychology 101, but I think this is also just like, we know this experience in our own lives, right? That so losses, yes, can absolutely be a death. It could also just be something as like you really messed up on a work project.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden there's like a loss of trust or a loss of maybe a role because maybe there's like a demotion necessarily or some probation or something, but there's loss in that. There's loss of a sense of like connection, feeling like I did a good job. So even that kind of loss um, requires some support around like how do we cope with that. And do we just kind of grin and bear it and pretend it didn't happen and get really defensive and just play off the same like patriarchal BS? Or do we actually allow there to be a pause and some space so that when loss occurs, there can actually be like a reflection around it and a teachable moment around it? And we're not just loading more like shame and guilt on people. So I think just the kind of changing nature of our working lives is definitely helping wake people up to that. Again, I think the pandemic has been huge for that. I think like working in a way more hybrid kind of way helps that too, because there's just like different kinds of needs for emotionally and mentally checking in with people than if we're in the same workplace every single day and we just kind of get really used to that format. So I think there's a lot of like great progress that's happening here. I'm seeing, in particular, a lot of the workplaces that are starting to find me and take on the Grief at Work program are ones that are more public facing and more client facing, because they're realizing that this isn't just about how their own employees feel and are
Hmm.
functioning, but it's also really about how they're delivering to clients too. I'm working with a large transportation firm whose whose transportation planners and bus operators have just been experiencing so much grief in just like how they deliver safe streets, how they
Hmm.
deliver good transportation access. Um, and that there's so many people in our cities and communities who are really struggling. There's a lot of changing nature of how we're using our systems, and so that's a perfect example of where actually like there's kind of this twofold. It's like the more we can equip employees to know how to support themselves and support each other in the workplace, we can also do a better job of doing that for our clients too when things comes up for them, which is really a win-win, I think.
So within the workplace, then, what is what word do I want to say? Like, not necessarily the impact of ignoring this, or maybe instead like the risk of not addressing these things, of not having these conversations and making that space for people.
Yeah, I think I mean there are a ton of harmful aspects when we don't make space for just processing loss or allowing someone to have their grieving experience. But I will say, I've been doing some work this year, particularly at the intersection of grief and burnout.
Mm,
And I actually led a couple workshops earlier this year called like "Loss is What Burnout's All About," and wrote a piece for Transform as well on this, because um, I think burnout obviously is being talked about a ton these days, thank goodness. And burnout, of course, being just like the depleted energy and exhaustion, these feelings of like negativity and cynicism and feelings of ineffectiveness. So a lot of times when people hear burnout, they're like, well, isn't that just a reaction to like having too much stuff? To like feeling overwhelmed by so much. And yes, but actually the effects of burnout are going to activate sense of loss, right? Loss of energy, loss of passion, loss of care, loss of feeling connected or engaged. And so, then that puts us in this kind of freeze burnout state, which is actually just our bodies trying to prevent us from experiencing even more damaging loss.
mm,
And so, actually that like in order to kind of go towards the loss that we fear, we need tools for like both processing the loss and also just a healthy sense of what holds us up. So I think looking at the aspects of, that actually a ton of loss is underlying burnout, and that if we get ahead of this and are more proactive about this and really use what are pretty common sense like tools and resources around this, that actually I think it can in some cases prevent burnout altogether, but also just when burnout arises, that all of a sudden people just there's more capacity to feel it out, recognize what's coming up, and then not add those extra layers of like shame or guilt or that easily get poured onto burnout.
That's the perfect segue into the tools and resources. So, is the onus on the employer, on colleagues, on everybody in the workplace? What does that look like? And
Yeah,
how do we begin?
totally. I think this is what's been really fun, dare I say, about doing this work is, as I keep saying, it is so not a one size fits all approach. So I just love getting to design different kind of programs and approaches and toolkits with different workplaces, what based on what the dynamic is. For I mean, there are so many things that I think we kind of all know that like even if you just take a second, think for yourself, like what are the things that have helped you go through a hard time and process a loss, right? And like so often we kind of already know the answer. Usually space and time is really helpful. Usually acknowledgement is really helpful. But also like potentially mindfulness and contemplative practices, having some kind of rituals or ceremony, movement and exercise is super helpful. I know for me, music is like critical. Connection to nature or living things. So like there's all these things, even laughter and joy is
Mhm.
actually, even this is well documented in research that laughter and joy is a really key tool for how we move through a difficult time and through loss. And so, there's like all these different kinds of things that I think workplaces can directly and even indirectly support. So, on the most direct level is like, yeah, is if you have like a medium to large size workplace, can you offer like an ERG around sort of grief and loss? Can you create sort of like a weekly lunch meetup for anyone that wants to talk about like tough times? Anything? Also, do you have, does your EAP that you're offering your employees have, not just one-on-one counseling, but also support groups around this? Then there's also the like, how are you making access to nature accessible to your workplace? Can you, recommend some like hikes or local nature trails or do an outing with that? How are you kind of as a workplace and as a team standing up for justice and making your employees know that you care about the kinds of things that are going on in the world? That's a way that people are going to feel more supported of like, oh, I'm feeling like the loss I'm feeling right now because of what's happening in the world is being acknowledged in my workplace or in my team or in this community. So again, these are like it's actually, I feel like, really simple things. It's just what I love to do is come in and help really kind of tell the story, get some feelings on the table. Usually we're unearthing a couple of bad experiences too, and then really kind of looking at the both like community level and systems level of how do we package some tools and resources together. I'd also say that bereavement leave is another huge one. Thankfully, more and more companies today are starting to really unbox their bereavement leave, recognizing that bereavement leave is something that should support people in their grief process and not hinder or restrict who it's for, what it's for. I mean, I've heard so many horror stories about people who experience like pet loss or a neighbor who passes away who they've been taking care of. I had this last year in my own life. I was helping a neighbor who had cancer pass, and it took so much of my time and energy, and grieving her loss was really difficult. And when workplaces or HR departments don't trust that that's like an adequate enough loss to require some time and space, that causes a lot of harm. And again, then you're going to have higher burnout, higher turnover, because people aren't going to feel like their workplace trusts them. So again, it just comes back to like so much of this, I think, is really about like basic trust building and different kinds of tools and resources and policies to help us do that. One more that I'm thinking of that I want to share is, especially on the kind of two-way street of trust, I think is
Mhm.
having ways that workplaces can like do time banking or other kinds of like time sharing, so that way when you do need some extra time, that there is someone else who can potentially help take on a role or take on something, and then when they need some time, there's also someone else, and that there's a couple hours in the week that are just allocated to this kind of like, how do we do some resource sharing with each other. I think that's super helpful because then um, employers and HR can feel like the work is generally getting done, and that someone taking the time and space they need isn't a huge detriment, and that everybody is still kind of, you're creating a workplace culture where people are willing to pitch in when it's needed.
You made fantastic points and so many things that really resonate. My goodness, allergies resonate with me. Where I had a pet loss almost a year ago, and it was like fast and unexpected, and it was like a Friday, and I was at this point where I was like, "Ugh, I have stuff to do at work, and now I have to cremate my cat. Like, this is how do I manage these things?" And I'm thankful that I work at a place where everyone was like, "Go do that." Like, you don't have to email us. What? Just go. Like, also, it's Friday. Like, just leave. Take the weekend. Do what you need to do. Maybe take Monday. Whatever. Just create space for yourself to grieve the loss. And
That's
that's so
amazing.
right. And it's so different from previous experience where I had where like that was my cat, although a family member. My husband, his grandfather had passed away, and I had worked at a different organization where it was like, well, it's not your grandfather, so you can have like maybe one day. I was like,
Yeah.
what? How do you like really tries to like check boxes on like, well, how closely were you related? How much time do you get off for that? Versus a
Right.
place that's like,
Can
it's
you,
your cat, end of
send
the
in the,
world,
right,
everything
send in
stops.
the death certificate and we're going to match the last names, and you're like, what? No, that's so inhumane. And again, I think like, also sadly, like we live in a world where there's a lot of like unjustness, and sometimes that unjustness and violence can like just really trigger us and reflect our own identity and our own background. And how are you going
Yes.
to tell people who like are seeing mass bloodshed or mass violence against people who they identify with, that like they have to show up for work the next day in the same way that everyone else is? It's like,
Yeah.
again, it's just, I think it's really, I'm so glad that you're creating this space of getting personal to really talk about just how do we be full-fledged human beings in our workplace, because we can do this. And I always, for the people that really need to understand the ROI of it, like, this is absolutely 100% medium to long term great ROI, because you're going to have like better staff retention, more well feeling, psychologically supported employees. But even in the short term, you're going to create moments and experiences of trust building and a sense of care, that are going to make people actually feel more invested and more excited about where they work. And just like you're talking about, like the fact that you work for Compt, and Compt was so like, of course, your colleagues were like, yeah, take the time you need because we trust you and because this is important. And so I just think that's awesome, and exactly what Grief at Work is trying to create.
Yeah. Create spaces for people so that they can bring their whole selves to work, and then you can be productive and not drained and burnt out and all of the other things based on what is happening in life and the world around you. I think that's really what work life balance means. But, we have these conversations, and I'm so glad that you were able to join me today. But it's like, 20 something minutes isn't enough to truly uncover what we need to uncover here. So, if there are workplaces that are interested in the work that you do, or trying to make that space, but maybe they're they're so stuck in their ways, or they can't really see outside or see beyond what is currently existing within their workplace culture? How can they reach out to you? How can you help them?
Absolutely. I'm obviously a bit biased, but I think bringing in kind of a third party neutral support system on this is so helpful. I think it can be really hard to just do this internally, especially when your workplace culture is already kind of baked in a certain way. And so, yes, you can find me at my website, which is just ari.fyi. That's ari.fyi. That's also me on my socials. I'm on LinkedIn, / Ari Simon. And yeah, again, love to be able to kind of package different, like sometimes workplaces are more looking for just listening spaces and facilitating those kind of tough conversations. Love doing that. Then also kind of working with HR folks or other managers on how do we really think about the kind of systems level around this, and policies and plans and programs. So yeah, it's a very flexible, adaptable program, but definitely excited for all the ways grief at work is coming into workplaces.
And to dip your toes in your newsletter is excellent as well. I always read it.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Sign up, subscribe. Maybe there'll be some links.
Exactly. I will definitely link to everything. Thank you for joining me today. And for anyone watching, if you'd like to be a guest on Getting Personal with Compt, send me an email, lauren@compt.io. We'll talk about all things workplace and making just a better human experience for not just our employees, but like for ourselves too. Thanks,
Mhm.
everyone.